This is Open to Debate. I'm John Donvan. Hi, everybody. A declaration by the American president made early in his second term. Quote, "We are going to conquer the vast frontiers of science, and we are going to lead humanity into space and plant the American flag on the planet Mars." Donald Trump addressing Congress on March 4th, 2025. Putting people on Mars is, of course, a long-standing dream, or pipe dream, depending on your viewpoint. NASA, America's space agency, has seemed committed in some way to making that happen, but not with the same energy and focus that put men on the moon in 1969, only 8 years after NASA set out to do that. Not that the agency is not interested in Mars. There are 2 Mars rovers up there right now that NASA sent, exploring the planet. NASA orbiters are circling, but those are robots. They are not people. And NASA's more immediate effort involving people has been getting back to the moon, both for its own sake and then eventually as a stepping stone to Mars. But at the same time, other players are joining the game who do seem in more of a hurry to put people on the Martian surface. There's China, of course, and India, Elon Musk's SpaceX, and of course we know how much he's got the ear of the president, whose recent declaration to Congress suggests that he too wants to hurry things up for America. So should we? Should we be organizing our efforts and energies around putting women and men on Mars? Or is there a case to do the exact opposite, which would be to walk away from the whole idea of humans on the red planet? As we come up on the 62nd anniversary of the discovery of water on Mars, that's the issue we're going to debate, framed around this question. Should the U.S. prioritize settling Mars? Let's meet our debaters. Answering yes to that question, I want to welcome Eric Berger. Eric is a journalist and a meteorologist who is the senior space editor at Ars Technica, as well as the author of 2 books, Liftoff and Reentry, which both detail the rise and continued story of SpaceX. Eric, welcome to the program. It's great to have you.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks very much.
And answering no to the question, which again, should the U.S. prioritize settling Mars, I want to welcome Shannon Stirone. Shannon is a freelance science writer with a focus on space. Her work has been featured in The Atlantic and in Wired and The Washington Post and National Geographic and a lot of others. Her work has also been anthologized in Best American Science and Nature Writing in 2019, 2020, and 2021. Sharon, welcome to the program. It's great to have you on Open to Debate.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
All right, let's get to our opening statements. This is a chance where each of you has the floor to yourself exclusively for a few minutes to explain why you're answering yes or no to our question. Eric, you are up first. Again, the question, should the U.S. prioritize settling Mars? Your answer is yes. Please tell us why.
So I live in Houston, Texas, just a few miles from Johnson Space Center. The city's pro basketball team is named the Rockets. So we love space down here. And speaking of the Rockets, they won their first NBA championship 30 years ago. They played the New York Knicks. Now you're probably thinking, how is this germane? Well, here's how. The NBA Finals take place during the summer and it gets hot and humid here. One of the sports writers covering the series for the New York Post apparently did not enjoy his midsummer visit to Space City. Now I can empathize, but he described Houston as a steamy, bug-infested, nondescript prairie town. The headline over his column was a single word, hellhole. Now I have to tell you, I've lived in Houston for 30 years. I met my wife and raised a family here. We like it. It's really all about perspective. I bring this up because my colleague, who is a wonderful writer and journalist, has called Mars a hellhole many times over. And you know what? I totally concede the point. So it's like the debate over? Seriously, Mars on its best day is far less hospitable than Antarctica on its worst day. Yet that does not mean we should not go. Mars is a hellhole compared to Hawaii, even to Houston in midsummer. But it is the best, nearest option for humans to try to live off this planet. Sure, there's no breathable air, and prolonged exposure to radiation on the surface is problematic. But you should try living on the moon Europa. Now that's really a hellhole. What this debate comes down to is whether you think humans should live on Earth forever, or whether we should expand outward and into the unknown. It is in our nature to explore, to multiply, and to satiate our curiosity about what is beyond the next hill. Some people argue against humans going to Mars and other worlds, saying we will harm them. What right do we have, especially after what we've done on Earth, to trample other worlds under our boots? Well, I have my concerns about what humans are doing on Earth, deep concerns. But I also like to live in a house. I like to eat 3 meals a day, and I certainly like air conditioning in the summer in Houston. Humans modify their environments. It's what we do. Unlike some critics of our species, I just don't see us as a vermin bringing war and pestilence to new and pristine worlds. For all of our faults, I think humans are mostly good. So why should we go to Mars and settle there? Well, I don't think it should be to find a backup for planet Earth. Astronomers have identified and characterized thousands of exoplanets during the last 2 decades. But this is still the best world we know of, and we should do everything to keep it that way. The real reason to go to Mars, I believe, is because humans should be a spacefaring species. It really is the next step forward. And the good news is that flying to and living in new and challenging environments will spur humans to come up with new solutions to old problems. Think about the major challenges of surviving on Mars. There's a shortage of arable land, like there's none. There's a lack of power, and it's really just a hostile environment in general. Yes, I concede all of this. Mars is a hellhole right now. So one can only imagine the advancements in biotechnology, robotics, solar and nuclear energy, geoengineering, and much more that we dreamed up to solve these problems. And these ideas will all have immeasurable benefits back here on Earth. And think about this. So much of the 20th and 21st centuries have been marked by human degradation of this world. Deforestation, climate change, landfills, nuclear waste. How much of a redemptive story for our species would it be if we could take on another world, a dry and desolate place like Mars, and renew conditions for life there? That is what is possible in the future by taking the first steps towards space settlement today. It boils down to this. If we are never, ever going to leave Earth to explore and settle beyond this rock, then what does that mean for our species? It's so limiting. Humans don't like to live in a box, however large and green our current planet is. So I choose to expand humanity rather than chaining us to a single world. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion today.
Thank you very much, Eric. So, Shannon, you disagree. You believe the U.S. should not prioritize settling Mars. You have this chance now to make your case.
Thank you. I want to start with a quote from Ursula Le Guin. "It's a rare gift to know where you need to be before you've been to all the places you don't need to be." I am arguing no, today and forever, that we should focus on settling humans on Mars for a few different reasons. I'm going to focus on 4. The first is that it is illegal and unethical. There is this thing called the Outer Space Treaty, which was formed in 1967, where many nations essentially agreed to the peaceful use of outer space. This was during the Cold War. While it is wildly outdated, the ethics behind it still stand. The 2 most important parts of that treaty for today's debate are one, that no nation can stake a claim on any planetary body, whether that's an asteroid or a planet. The second is regarding planetary protection, that no nation should interfere with the integrity of any planetary body if there perhaps was once life or could be life currently. So any expansion or human settlement on Mars would automatically violate both of those. The second reason, and I think Eric pointed this out in his opening, is the idea of settlement and colonization. I personally find it appalling that after hundreds of years of bearing witness to the consequences of colonization, that it is still a part of a conversation that we should still think about doing that off-world. That we have not thoroughly learned our lesson to what happens to people and to our society when we are pro-colonization. The third, as Eric mentioned, is that Mars is a hellhole. It is not hospitable to humans. There's no air, there's no water, the radiation is out of control, the soil is toxic, it's full of perchlorates. The pressure is so low that if you got a small puncture in your spacesuit, you're going to start to asphyxiate, and while you asphyxiate, your blood will boil, evaporate, and freeze at the same time. And the fourth is that I am a huge proponent of space exploration. Anything I've ever written has been pro-space exploration. I think there is a huge difference between actual true exploration in the name of science and staking claim for a place where we think that we should go. I think that, as Eric I'm sure knows, and everybody knows this, that the amount of money it would take to build any kind of infrastructure on Mars, whether that's for 3 humans or for a whole settlement of people, is trillions and trillions of dollars. And it is absurd to me that we would even entertain the idea of investing that many resources into a world that is so deadly when we have a perfectly wonderful planet here that desperately needs our help. We need help living here. I think that we absolutely must keep exploring Mars. I think we absolutely must keep exploring the universe and the solar system. It is one of the most incredible things humans can do. But I really struggle with this narrative about settlement, that we should be an interplanetary species. Why? That's what I want to know. That's what I struggle with. Why do we need to? Why is robotic exploration not enough? Why do we feel so pushed against these limits? I think that we are attached to this idea of interplanetary immortality. And it is in a large form rejection of the limits as human beings, that we die, that we have limits here on Earth. Maybe we're stuck here, but I think that the narrative and the story that we're constantly hearing that we should become interplanetary with humans is actually a really dangerous one.
Thank you very much. I want to summarize what I think that I've heard each of you say, but first I'm just curious about things that have inspired you to be interested in this topic in the first place. I know for myself, it was watching the moon landing as a child. And I remember specifically that night going out to my backyard and looking up at the moon and thinking things would never be the same again, because I was looking at a place in the sky where there are actually people. And it's a fascinating thought that stays with me to this day. Eric, I'm wondering for you, was it something like that? Was it reading science fiction? Where did your interest come from?
So I have really two formative moments, I think, that propelled me to study astronomy in college. Very useful degree, by the way. First of these was when I was a kid, we had an assignment, and this probably was third or fourth grade, so it was like around 1980 or early 1980s. And we wrote to NASA via post, just asking them for more information about what they were doing. And I got back these wonderful 8x11 glossy photos, some taken by the Voyagers of both Jupiter and the outer planets. And it just was, first of all, it was so cool that NASA, right, this agency, which only, a decade earlier had sent people to the moon, would write back to me, right, and then sent these images, these evocative images about what was out there. That was really inspiring. And then the other thing was I grew up in rural Michigan, and a couple times a year there would be these spectacular meteor showers. And I just remember, in the dead of winter, sort of getting bundled up and going out and laying in my backyard and looking up at the stars and seeing these incredible meteor showers of things falling back to Earth. And just, that was such a powerful moment to see that. It sort of ignited with me a lifelong interest in looking up at the stars and seeing and wondering what was out there and thinking, what would it be like to go there? And so I've just had a fascination with space for my entire life since then.
What about you, Shannon? Anything like that for you?
Different story, but similar. I've always been interested in space. I think it started when I was around 7 or 8 when I saw Saturn through a telescope, and really hit me that that's an entirely separate world from this one. And I would stay up late at night trying to zoom out from Earth and LA and trying to figure out, God, this universe is so big. And it just blew my mind. And then when I was 13, like many people have this story, I saw the movie Contact, and it changed my life. I wanted to be Ellie Arroway. I still do. I would go in that ship if given the chance right now, even if it meant never coming back. It makes me feel such a sense of awe and connection. And I think for me, it's really moving that I'm a part of this really beautiful universe, and that somehow we came to be in it. I think it's incredible.
Okay, so what we all have in common, 3 space nerds, and there are more of us out there than I think people understand, and I think we're going to probably convert a few people today with this debate. And although we just found common ground on being space nerds, this is a debate. We're taking on this question: should the U.S. prioritize settling Mars? And in our opening statements, to summarize very briefly, I heard Eric, you make the point fundamentally that the human race was born to expand, that we are curious, that it's always been our history, that it's almost a moral imperative to continue to explore and to go farther than we've already gone before, that there's always a frontier before us, and that in fact, in pursuing this particular frontier, there is a great deal to be learned. If we ultimately would succeed in reaching the goal of settling on Mars, how much would we have learned? How much new technology, how much progress would have been made in areas of science and just understanding, and perhaps even philosophy, as we understand more and more how our horizons can expand. You do concede that Mars, however, at the moment is a hellhole. Shannon Stirone, you argue that Mars is a hellhole, and that's one of your reasons for making the case that we should not be putting humans into this effort. You do believe very much in exploration, but you're saying primarily through technology, not by putting people up there. That going to Mars would be both illegal and unethical. You also make the point that colonization, we have a history of learning the downside of colonization, particularly if there's a place where there might have been life in the past or may still be life that's undetermined at this point on Mars, but there are reasons to believe that perhaps there was life there in the past, and that's fundamentally why you feel that now and forever you say we should not be putting people on Mars, or actually anywhere, I think, beyond our immediate neighborhood. I'm not sure. We'll perhaps talk about how you feel about the moon. But I think those are the the main dividing lines I've heard. And I want to take, since you structured your argument so particularly, Shannon, I want to use that as a little bit of a structure to take it back to Eric. So you've heard Shannon say that it's unethical and not to mention illegal under existing treaties, international treaties, to settle Mars. I think we could go back and forth on the illegality issue and maybe not get very far on where we feel about that. But on the unethical part of it, there's more to dig into there. And I just want to ask you, do you recognize the case that she's making? Not to agree with her, but do you recognize what's at stake and what Shannon's talking about, and what's your response to it?
Well, first of all, let me just say on the legal side, I am not a space lawyer, but certainly I've read the Outer Space Treaty, which was created back in 1967, I believe. And it does preclude nations, existing nations. The United States cannot go to Mars and declare that this is part of the United States, just as we can't go to the moon and do that. But you could create new nations on Mars. So if you took a private mission to Mars and set up a settlement there, that's perfectly legal. And, you know, in regard to the other issue that she raised, NASA has been working to identify regions of Mars where there is likely not extant life, if there is life anywhere on the planet, and that these would be good places, you know, for humans to go if they were, you know, to explore there. You know, as for her argument about, you know, the ethical part of this, and I think, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but I just would probably like to get a better sense from her of what sort of the real objection to having humans on Mars is. Is it concern about, you know, destroying a pristine ecosystem? Is it concern about sort of the possibility that there are microbes below the surface that we would be changing their ecosystem? So I'd love to respond to that, but I just would want to get a little better sense of her objections from an ethical standpoint.
My ethical objections are several-fold. What you mentioned, Eric, that yes, it takes a lot of effort for us to find out whether there was once life or is currently life. It's tremendously laborious with our little rovers. But for me, I really struggle with what obviously interfering with a pristine wilderness, an environment that we have agreed to protect, the same way we protect our wilderness here on Earth. For me, I also struggle with this feeling of entitlement, and I think that it is worth pointing out for me. The ethical part is this: it is so deep-seated in our culture to be colonialists, to really feel this entitlement that, well, we should send a private space company like SpaceX and set up a settlement on Mars. When I personally feel like that would end in disaster on many different reasons. People would die, but then you're introducing a whole host of other ethical issues. Like if you go with this private space flight, someone controls your air, someone controls your access to water, someone controls your access to food. Then you're really in trouble. Now you're looking at forced labor and a whole host of ethical problems. I think we really have to pause and think about where that sense of should comes from.
So I hear you. I would sort of counter the fact that, you know, you clearly have objections to human history, but the whole of human history is sort of the outward expansion of humans, you know, with all of our messy problems, you know, out of Africa into Europe and, you know, doing damage to ecosystems. And there was the whole Neanderthal battle, and then obviously the problems with colonization of the Americas. That is all part of human history, and I'd like to think that maybe we've learned a little bit from that. But the reality is that there are not sentient life forms on Mars. There's probably not even microbes below the surface. We don't know that for sure. Certainly the rovers are looking for them.
Can I interrupt and actually just share that quote, that famous quote from Carl Sagan, where he says, if we do in fact find microbes on Mars, then Mars belongs to the microbes.
Well, that's fine. And I have a great respect for Carl Sagan. Had the pleasure and honor to meet him at one point. But, I think reasonable people could disagree about that. Did Antarctica belong to the microbes before people went there? I mean, it's just, I think we have a fundamental disagreement here. And I don't think we're going to change each other's minds, but I don't think that we should not visit other worlds as people because there's the possibility of microbial life there.
Can I ask you one question, Eric, about this? We started out as microorganisms. We've evolved over billions of years from microorganisms. If there was another species that felt it was entitled to come and trample all over Earth and destroy any potential of us evolving into the beings that we are, do you think that that's right?
I'm not sure that that's right or not. I'd prefer to have a robust space program to deal with that eventuality if it came to it. The fact of the matter is that, again, there probably is not life on Mars. And so we're going to lock ourselves into, this planet and never go anywhere because of the possibility that life could exist. Like I said, NASA has thought pretty deeply and seriously about this problem, is identifying zones where they believe it would be safe for humans to land and not disrupt any ecosystem that might be existing on Mars. So, I'm not sure, we're going to agree on this, and I guess that's good since this is a debate. But again, if we take that attitude, then we're never going to go anywhere in space. And I just think that ultimately is incredibly limiting for the human experience.
The Voyagers have left the heliopause. To say we're not going anywhere in space is false. I think that what you're pointing out, Eric, is this: we really struggle as humans, which I get, to see our robotic explorers as surrogates of ourselves. We really relate to seeing human beings doing things that we wish we could do. It's just like mirror neurons 101. But to say that we haven't been anywhere is insulting to NASA's history and to us as humans. We have been all over the place. There's so many places for us to go, but to limit human exploration as the definition of going somewhere, then I think that's not the best way to frame it.
Let me jump in for a moment and ask another question that has an ethical consideration. And that is, as I understand it, the Earth is not going to be habitable for humans forever. I mean, I think the number is something like 1.5 billion years out because of the way the sun's going to behave. Earth becomes uninhabitable for humans. It's the end of the human race. Is there any sort of ethical imperative to try to save ourselves? And I know, Eric, you weren't necessarily making the lifeboat argument, but is there an ethical imperative to try to save ourselves? Or did I hear you say in your opening, Shannon, that sometimes death is part of life and death of the human race, I think you were implying, is just something we have to accept?
Yeah, I think that actually, if you talk to a psychologist about our obsession with becoming interplanetary, that there really is ultimately this denial of death, and that this like resistance to our limits as being humans. And I think that that's a totally natural thing to struggle with. But no matter how far out you look, there are endings. Things end. And I think that is ultimately what makes life meaningful and beautiful as human beings that have managed to live on this planet. And I think resisting against that fights back at our very nature of humanity and forces us to look elsewhere for distractions instead of thinking about what actually really matters here. Again, exploration is imperative, but trying to fight death is not going to happen, especially going to a place that really is going to kill you faster than anywhere on Earth. So
let me let Eric jump in and see what his response is to that.
Let me say a couple of things. First of all, I would pretty strongly disagree that it's not in human nature to struggle against death. I mean, the whole idea of natural selection and evolution and the origin of species is the struggle for survival. That's pretty hardwired into all life on Earth, including human beings, and I think it explains some of our behaviors. But as the question you asked, John, about, should it be an ethical consideration that we should try to ensure the survival of the human species? I think that's what you were getting at. It is interesting if you look at surveys that are done about the things that NASA should be doing, right? Public surveys about what the space agency ought to be spending its money on. Very last on them is settling the moon or Mars, right? That is not a public priority, absolutely. But what is consistently one of two top priorities is, one is Earth science. People want to study the planet and understand it. The other is protect us from asteroids. And I think that is a proxy for making sure that, Earth is habitable and humans survive. And so I think in that sense that, if we're going to have a space program, part of its mission ought to be to ensure human survival.
I have to share, this is the thing. NASA calls Mars a punching bag for asteroids. There is one that lands on Mars roughly every single day that creates a crater of about 26 feet across in diameter. That's a large sailboat. There's no atmosphere to slow down meteorites or asteroids. It gets pummeled all the time. If you want to avoid getting hit by an asteroid, that is the worst place in the solar system. Worse than here.
All right, I want to bring it a little bit down to earth now with a different consideration. And as I mentioned in the opening, there are competitors working to get to Mars, and very potentially before the United States does, if this becomes an American mission ultimately. China is very seriously focused on getting up there pretty soon. There's a whole issue right now where the samples that the rovers are taking, there's no way to get that stuff back to Earth, and that's a long-term project which might take another decade for NASA to figure out a way to get samples that are being taken on the planet back to Earth. China is already positioning itself to do that a lot earlier. I want to ask you to discuss, and this was not something either of you brought up in your opening, but just the space race aspect of this, which, as we recall from the 1960s, the space race with the Soviet Union motivated so much of what NASA did. Would you address that first, Eric? Whether for you that's a case for as our opening statement, as our question that we're debating embodies, that we should prioritize Mars settlement now.
So, first of all, the space race, as it can certainly concede right now between the United States and China, is primarily over the moon. Right? It's the Artemis program versus the International Lunar Research Station that China has. So Mars is kind of in the background of that competition, but I think quite clearly China has very serious space ambitions, and they have the very first spacecraft that they sent to Mars not only landed on Mars, but deployed a rover, and no nation had ever done anything like that in terms of Mars exploration. So they clearly have a credible program, and they do have long-term ambitions to, as you said, not just return samples, which they very well could do before NASA does, but also put astronauts on the moon. On the moon and then on Mars. And so, to the extent that we have values in the United States, right, today, I think we'd want to project those values not just to the moon, but to Mars. And to get there, to be in the game, you have to be there. And so, yeah, I think the space race is definitely part of it. I don't think we're actively engaged right now in a space race with China to get humans on Mars, but certainly that will be an increasing issue in coming decades, I have to believe.
I think it's interesting that you use the word game. I think that I think the administration and a lot of people think about this as a game, as a zero-sum game. And instead of, I understand that there's geopolitics involved, but ultimately, it would cost us so much money to focus on any kind of Mars program. And Eric, as you know better than anybody, the plans change with every administration. There's such a lack of consistency. I think he and I can actually agree on this. There's such a lack of consistency between presidential administrations that one administration it's Mars, and the next it's the moon, and the next it's like, actually, let's not do either of those things. And it really keeps NASA from being able to have a steady flow of money towards some specific program. I think that if we're going to go to Mars for science reasons with human scientists, that's a different story.
I would want to push back a little bit. We've talked a lot about the cost of going to Mars. And I absolutely agree that if we're going to use the traditional procurement and methods that NASA has, like if you look in their directive and sort of look at their mission plans, it's like 6 to 8 to 10 launches of their biggest version of the Space Launch System rocket. And so this is like a human mission, a single human mission would cost, Sharon's right, hundreds of billions of dollars, right? That has been the whole thrust of the push toward reusable rockets. And I realize that Elon Musk is a pretty toxic person in terms of his behaviors to a lot of people. And they don't like what he's doing with the US government. They don't like the things he says and the way he behaves. And I completely understand that and sympathetic toward that. But the reality is that over the last 20 years, we have seen a revolution in reusable spaceflight, and we are potentially on the cusp of having reusable large reusable rockets that can put lots of payload into orbit. And so I think the interesting thing, and I think the reason why this debate is valuable to have right now, is that yes, starships are blowing up, but at some point they're going to stop blowing up, and they're going to start flying into orbit pretty frequently. If we can use the Falcon 9 rocket as a guide, it's going to fly 150 times this year. They're launching them basically every other day. And so we are actually, for the first time, able to discuss, not just as theoretical, but as real, the potential to send large payloads to Mars. I mean, the biggest rovers we've sent to Mars, the biggest payloads are about 1 ton. And the potential for a vehicle like Starship, and to be clear, there's nothing else in the market today or even under development by anyone anywhere that's like this, is the potential to send 100 tons at a time to the surface of Mars. Now, SpaceX has a long way to go to make that a reality, but that's a vision, and they've made credible steps toward that. And so you are talking about, for the first time, having the ability to send lots of stuff, and humans would need lots of stuff on Mars, and to do it for a reasonable cost, because Starship launches are not going to cost $2 billion. They're going to cost on the order of tens of millions of dollars, most likely. So I would push back that this is a $1 trillion program. And I would also kind of push back and say that it's probably not going to entirely be funded by governments. There will be commercial participation and investment. And so, it's not something that's going to break the bank of the US government, because it's going to be done differently, or it's not going to be done at all. Like, the US government will never send a human mission to Mars, I don't think.
And I just wanted to check in with you on, Shannon, on one thing that occurs to me, because in terms of prioritizing Mars would suggest deprioritizing something else, especially for NASA, which has been mentioned. The Artemis project is focused on getting back to the moon. Where are you on the moon exploration part of this? And is your argument that we should stick to Earth an argument that we should not have gone to the moon in 1969?
No, I think it's amazing I think the Apollo program was absolutely incredible. And yes, it was done for geopolitical competition with Russia, but it was an absolutely inspiring, incredible, and scientific endeavor. I don't think that going to the moon in the past was a bad decision at all. I personally see there's scientific value in studying like the ice in the craters of the moon, and there's lots of different scientific missions. But in terms of having a human presence on the moon, I personally think the Artemis program is kind of a waste. I mean, maybe that's a controversial thing to say, but we've been there. And I realize that there's technological reasons why building the infrastructure to go back to the moon helps us leapfrog into going back to Mars, or going to Mars with humans in general. But I don't see the purpose of it.
You would deprioritize Artemis regardless.
Completely.
And I want to ask you the same question. In terms of prioritizing, something has to be deprioritized. Eric, would you deprioritize the Artemis program to get back to the moon in order for somebody else potentially to go to Mars, since Artemis seems to be a kind of Mars launching pad idea?
No, I would not deprioritize Artemis. I think the idea behind it is good. It's been an excellent vehicle to build international collaboration and cooperation. Dozens of nations have signed the Artemis Accords that sort of want to follow the strictures put up by the Outer Space Treaty and sharing data and openness and transparency and things like that. I think that's all quite good. There are elements of it that are superfluous, like there's a proposal to build a lunar space station that's very expensive and doesn't really add to the surface program. I believe we should move really fully into commercial launch programs. But there are ways to do Artemis more affordably.
Commercial launch programs on the moon?
To the moon.
So what? Sorry, you go ahead, Shannon.
Oh, I'm just wondering, how do you see that going with private space companies having the ability? I realize they need FAA launch licenses to launch off of Earth, but how do you see that going in terms of abiding by the international agreements that we have with not contaminating other worlds or misusing them? Because unfortunately, as we can see in the world we're in right now, that never doesn't go well. So I'm wondering,
the first thing the Apollo 11 crew did when they landed on the moon was jettison their trash.
I know.
Right? So it's like, the exploration is not perfect, right? And so I think it's an open question. I think you're going to have, and NASA will be involved in sort of setting the ground rules of what happens and trying to abide by norms and so forth. But look, humans are flawed, and like their companies are going to go and make money and try to do what they want. And so I think, again, the fundamental question is, do we want to extend the sphere of human activity, good, bad, ugly, to other worlds, or do we want to keep it confined here on Earth?
And what we'd like to do at this point in the program is bring in some other voices, individuals who are subject matter experts in this topic because they write about it or they've lived it in one way or the other. And the first person I want to welcome in is David Ariosto. David is co-host of the Space Minds podcast and author of Open Space from Earth to Eternity. David, welcome to Open to Debate. And I want to say welcome back because you used to be one of the producers on our staff, and now you are focusing on space you have 2 podcasts going in addition to the book coming out. Congratulations on all of that. But please come in and tell us what your question is for our debaters today.
All right. Thanks for having me, John. So I have a question for Eric and a question for Sharon. Eric, the first English colony in the New World was effectively a public-private partnership between the English Crown and a private entity. But what came of it was sort of a rough place, right? There was just indentured servitude and settlers were employees and sort of lots of abuses, lots of bonded debt. And so I guess my question is there a danger then with this sort of corporate-driven future that we're looking at toward the red planet, a sort of similar sensibility, or are those just sort of growing pains in all of this? And Sharon, the question I have for you,
David, would you hold off and let Eric answer that one so that we remember your second question? Thanks.
Thanks, David. I've been enjoying your podcast at Space News. Look, the history of human colonization on Earth, and especially with Jamestown, as you reference, are some pretty ugly developments. I'm not sure there's any way to sugarcoat it. And so, yes, that's absolutely a real concern. When people say, do you want Elon Musk deciding how you're going to live on Mars? Do you want him setting the price of air on the surface of Mars? I hear those concerns. I understand those concerns. And I think that we ought to learn from history. And I think the people going into these explorations, it's not going to be me. I'm 51. I feel like I'm probably too old to go to Mars. I'd love to visit a hotel on the moon one day. But I think that people going into it are going to have to be eyes wide open. There's going to have to be pretty clear terms for what happens. I think what we'll also see pretty quickly, and what bears out in human history, is that the group of people that goes off and establishes a settlement on Mars is going to create their own rules. They're going to be far beyond sort of the dictums or what rules or order initiated from Earth. They are going to be on their own, and they're going to make their own rules, and they probably will set those rules according to survival. And so will it become Lord of the Flies? Will it become something like Jamestown, or will it be better? It's definitely a risk, and I acknowledge that, and I think the people going that will be brave and will be taking on those risks.
Shannon, you get to comment on that question. Yeah.
Are those the options, Jamestown and Lord of the Flies?
Those are the worst. Those are the
better?
worst case. Those are the worst case options. Of course, we can do better. But I'm just acknowledging the fact that yes, that this is a valid concern, and I think it is something we ought to be thinking about beforehand, and so that there are strictures in place to address it.
David, your question for Shannon? I'm sorry,
Oh, sorry.
Shannon.
I was going to say,
ahead.
I think that we're sort of circling around an interesting topic nested in this, which is who gets to go, who goes, who's a part of the settlement. Who is making those laws when you're there? Are we abiding by an international treaty? Are we using American laws? I mean, there's just so much to talk about when it comes to this. But I think that maybe leaning towards it being something that we can do and it will go well is hubris.
David, your question for Shannon?
Sure. Well, Shannon, you've talked about the risks of going to Mars, the sort of the veritable hellhole that at least it currently is, but less about the risks of not going. And so I guess my question centers on, like, do we risk the loss of some of these downstream technologies that we got from the Apollo program, being like MRIs and computing and microelectronics and all of this that came at a time when the incentive was really just a geopolitical motivation and sort of a national prestige issue. And so there's that, and there, sort of maybe more importantly, this question of sort of the galvanizing effects of doing great big things that kind of you can filter and sort of see anecdotally through the population in terms of STEM involvement and the like.
So I think that I have a fundamental problem with that question in the sense that why does doing great big things have to always involve humans doing things off of the planet? I mean, NASA does great big things all the time. Other space agencies do great big things all the time. We develop technology on Earth without sending humans to other worlds that are life-changing and amazing. I don't think that the metric by which to measure doing great big things involves moving a select group of human beings to a really deadly planet. And your question about do we sacrifice the potential technological developments by not creating a Mars program? I want to make this clear. I think that we should send NASA scientists and astronauts to Mars to do science. I don't think they should stay there. I don't think NASA would ever let them stay there because they would likely die. I think we should do that. I'm talking about a long-term presence. I think that it is honestly delusional that we would consider that an actual viable option when we've got a really cool planet. There's air. I'm breathing it right now. It's great.
All right. We have to move on. David, thank you very much for your question. And now I want to bring in Andrea Leinfelder. Andrea is the Houston Chronicle's space reporter, where she covers NASA and the commercial space sector. Andrea, thanks for joining us. And I know you've been listening, so we're looking forward to hearing your question.
Yeah, thanks for having me. One thing that stands out to me is space is one of these areas where countries tend to collaborate, more or less, despite geopolitical tensions on Earth. Is there a way this collaborative spirit could be used to overcome some of these ethical issues that we've discussed surrounding sending humans to another world?
Hi, Andrea. I've in my most optimistic moments, you could see a Mars mission being a point where humans came together, right? We saw in The Martian, China helped out, but you could sort of see NASA and China and Russia, kind of all the great space programs, India coming together, sort of all contributing to a human Mars to Mars mission, this culmination of humanity and sort of giving us a project to work together when we're so much at odds here on Earth. Unfortunately, having covered the space program for a couple of decades now, I'm pretty cynical, and I have a hard time seeing that happen. Even with the Artemis program today, I think we're seeing some fundamental tensions play out now between the United States and Europe because of the actions of the Trump administration. So I think even sort of that partnership may get a little frayed. So I'd love to see that happen. It's just from a geopolitical reality standpoint, it's difficult for me to see it coming to fruition.
I'm sorry, but I agree with Eric. I think that there's an interesting part in this, which is that we think of any kind of space activity as being really separate from Earth when the consequences of any of that activity happens on Earth. If there is any conflict in space, it's playing out in war here. So I do think that there's a lot of challenges. I mean, when it comes to robotic space missions, there's so much international collaboration, and there's lots of reasons why that works well. But as our culture becomes more tumultuous and divided, it makes that collaboration much more difficult. It's not impossible, but I think in this moment would be really difficult.
Andrea, thank you very much for your question. And next up, I want to welcome Gina Sunseri. Gina has covered space exploration for ABC News, my former home, for 2 decades, including the evolution of the commercial space industry, as well as NASA's missions to Mars and other planets. Gina, welcome to Open to Debate, and please come on in with your question.
I think my question is this, that we've had 5 presidents back-to-back literally say we will go to Mars and with humans, and we have not. Politically, what needs to change to make this happen, and is it worth it?
I would say nothing needs to change politically. I think Shannon hit very strongly on one of the main stumbling blocks of this already, and that's cost, right? It has been enormously expensive to try to do it. There's a great book about the first Bush effort to do this called Mars Wars, which sort of goes into the political intrigue surrounding the development of the first, I think, vision for sending humans to Mars. Politically, I don't think anything needs to change. What needs to happen is you need actually a transportation system that enables this by unlocking lower cost access to space. And that really has been the thrust of the commercial space industry over the last 20 or 25 years, is building large rockets that can fly again and again and try to approach airplane-like operations. And so if you do eventually get to a transportation system that could open up Mars, then it becomes more of a viable political option. And so that is the promise of Starship, is that it could open that pathway to Mars, which really has been closed for all practical purposes heretofore.
I agree with Eric that the basic infrastructure, launch infrastructure, is required. That we have to have an actual transportation mechanism. But to go back to ethics, there's a reason why NASA, I mean, yes, the rockets aside, but there's a reason why NASA hasn't been ready to send humans to Mars yet, is because the radiation, the health effects, they ethically, also for PR reasons, they ethically cannot and will never send any of their astronauts to Mars until they can ensure their safe return home. And when I mean their safe return home, I mean not coming back with 3 months left to live because they have such extreme cancer. So until they have that, shielding has to be added to the transportation vehicles. There has to be water and extra steel to protect from the radiation exposure in transit and also while on Mars. So until that is solved, it's a no-go, which is why it's not been pushed forward, is one big reason why it's not been pushed forward from them.
Thank you very much for your question, Gina, and thanks for joining us. On the point that was just made, until Mars is made livable, Eric, what this program could benefit from is just a sort of image for the listener and the viewer to be able to imagine what would happen on Mars to make it livable, this notion of terraforming. Can you take 45 seconds to sum up what a livable would have to be done to a livable Mars, and what would be the approach taken to make that happen, so we can all picture what that's supposed to look like?
Well, I'm not an engineer. I'm certainly not an expert in geoengineering, and I would expect that the solution to making Mars more livable is very complex, challenging, and probably beyond our current means of accomplishing. So I don't have a great engineering answer for you. I just know that it probably is possible. There are some innovative ideas and solutions out there to address this. But I would absolutely concede that it's not going to happen anytime soon.
Is it your belief that it could happen, that it's a solvable problem?
Yes.
And does that lead to your kind of your opening statements, inspiration for the notion that we would learn so much by being able to do that in the way that we learned so much in the 60s through the race to the moon? How convinced are you of that? And then I want to take it to you, Shannon.
I think it's fundamentally true that the big problems, the humans only really solve big problems when they're facing them directly head on. And so if once we get to Mars and take data and really understand the nature of what's there and how bad it is, then we would find solutions. I mean, that is the whole point. That's all humans have done. The main thing they've done is take their surroundings and make them more livable and adaptable as we've sort of struggled with natural selection and evolution to survive. That's kind of what we've done.
Well, I have some science for you. So to me, terraforming and the idea of it, that is so unethical, but it is also, for me, just the definition of hubris. But the reason...
By the way, while defining it as hubris, can you just define terraforming for people who don't know that term?
So terraforming is using geoengineering techniques to create a livable, for humans, environment on the planet Mars. That is, like you've heard Elon...
So get oxygen into the atmosphere and raise the temperature and do something on a big global scale to change the reality of that
trying
planet.
to get some algae to bloom to then absorb some of the CO2 and release oxygen. But here's the thing. Mars is a third the size of Earth. It has cooled a lot faster than our planet. Its magnetic field, its core, is dormant. It's cooled off. It's done. Which means that there's no magnetic field. That magnetic field not only serves a purpose to reflect cosmic rays and radiation, but it also holds in an atmosphere. So you could, in some dream world, drop algae, melt the ice caps, take the oxygen out of the CO2 ice. But what we know and what we've learned from NASA missions is that once that magnetic field disappeared, the solar wind blew away Mars's atmosphere. So if you don't have an atmosphere, you don't have a magnetic field or an active core to hold on to that atmosphere, you're drawing words in the sand while the tide comes in. There's no point.
It's a big challenge. It's a big challenge. And yeah, the solar wind did strip the magnetic field away, billions of years ago when Mars was a livable world, we think. We think that conditions would have been great for life there. And if there's some way to take it back to that kind of condition, I think that would be great.
Okay, so we have a disagreement over techno-optimism in this moment.
It's also, terraforming is just theoretical. Like, it's not actually, there's no actual data behind that it could actually happen. It's just a conversation.
So let's move on to our closing round. In our closing round, you each have a chance to make one more case for your position of yes or no on whether the U.S. should prioritize settling Mars. You go first in this closing round, Eric. The floor is yours.
Well, Shannon, thanks for a great discussion today. I've really enjoyed talking to you about these things. One of my favorite works of science fiction is the Foundation series. It was written by Isaac Asimov, and I have found him to be remarkably insightful about the future. At the World's Fair in 1964, he made a series of predictions about what the world would look like half a century later, and he really got a lot of things right, like automated kitchen devices, satellite communication, HD TVs, lab-grown meat, solar power, and much, much more. And so I first read the Foundation series decades ago, about the same time I was looking up at those meteor showers. And a depiction of one planet in the novel Foundation Earth has stuck with me over the years. And at my age, believe me, I've forgotten a lot. But in their search for Earth, the protagonists visit a planet called Solaria. There are about just 1,200 people, inhabitants on the entire world, each estate occupied by a single person. They each have hundreds of robots to carry out their household and other tasks. These people never interacted, and they communicated via holograms and telekinesis. And what an odd, lonely, depressing world. And I guess that's why it stuck with me. It's, of course, not anything like Earth of today. But what about the future? In the developed world, birth rates have fallen well below the rate needed to maintain a steady population. And that's fine if I would probably agree that we've got too many people on the planet. But sometime around 2080, our population is going to start to shrink. And there are lots of hints in the current data that the population could rapidly contract in the 2100s. We're also at the beginning of a revolution in AI and robotics, and people spend more time staring at their screens than they do talking to other people. We're leading more insular lives. And I'm not saying Earth will become Solaria, but it does offer an extreme example of what might happen to a society that stops growing and expanding and becomes increasingly technology reliant and just turns inward on itself. So I say, let's let the most intrepid of us go off to Mars and make it less of a hellhole. Let's use it as a forward base to jump off to other places in the solar system, perhaps Ganymede or Titan or the clouds of Venus. and let us learn enough about living in difficult environments and long-duration spaceflight that one day we might settle worlds around other stars. That's the vision I have for humanity. It's fundamentally opposed to Shannon, I believe, but I do think that it's in our nature to go outward. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much. And now, Shannon, you get the last word. Again, your answer to the question, should the U.S. prioritize settling Mars, is no. Your closing on why you're a no.
Well, Eric, it's been a pleasure chatting with you about this. This has been really fun. I want to read one more quote before I finish. This is from Carl Jung. Space flights are merely an escape, a fleeing away from oneself, because it is easier to go to Mars or the moon than it is to penetrate one's own being. I will forever argue no, that we should not be focusing settling humans on Mars. I understand by this point that Mars has become this bright red symbol of immortality. We think if we can just get there, if we can just find a way to live there, we can outrun death. But in reality, the only thing waiting for us on Mars is death. It is a place to die, not a place to live. My wish is that we would recalibrate our relationship to the cosmos and the way that we think about Mars and other planets and our place in this universe. That we are a part of a shared environment, and we are stewards of this environment, the same way we're stewards of Yosemite or Yellowstone or Antarctica. My wish is that we would think about that we are a part of this beautiful universe, and that we can be a part of something without taking it, that we can be a part of something without destroying it. I know it's less romantic. I know it's less exciting. It's less science fiction. It's less adventurous, but we know how to fix the problem. We know that Mars is not actually the answer. The answer is here. We have a planet with everything we could possibly need. There's air, there's water, there's life, and there's a future. So thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. And that is a wrap on this debate. And I really want to thank both of you, Eric Berger and Shannon Stirone, for being willing to meet over this topic, to come to the table, and actually to have a very robust disagreement in such a civil and informative way. I think a lot of us learned a lot that we didn't know before, and you've given us a lot to think about. So thanks, both of you, for taking part in this Open to Debate program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
And I also want to thank my fellow journalists for bringing their expert questions to the table. So thank you, David and Andrea and Gina. And finally, a big thank you to you, our audience, for tuning into this episode of Open to Debate. You know, as a nonprofit working to combat extreme polarization through civil debate, our work is made possible by listeners like you and by the Rosencrantz Foundation and by supporters of Open to Debate. Robert Rosencrantz is our chairman. Our CEO is Clea Connor. Leo Mathau is our chief content officer. Elizabeth Kitzenberg is our chief advancement officer. Andrew Lipson is head of production. Michelle Debrasini is our director of marketing. This episode was produced by Alexis Pangrazi and Marlette Sandoval, editorial and research by Gabriella Mayer. Max Fulton provided production support. The Open to Debate team also includes Annalisa Cochran, Gabrielle Iannicelli, Rachel Kemp, Eric Gross, Linda Lee, Mary Regis, Tom Bunting, and Vlad Virtanen. Damon Whittemore mixed our episode, and our theme music is by Alex Clement. I'm John Donvan. We'll see you next time on Open to Debate.